So, hello everyone, welcome to our Global Course Connection podcast. Today we are going to dive into a topic that sits at the crossroads of sociology, gender, and environmental justice. Our theme today is the challenges faced by Indigenous women in Ecuador and how these challenges are mirrored in other societies. These Indigenous women have been disproportionately affected by systemic inequalities since the first contact with Spanish colonizers in the 16th century. And they face these challenges in every aspect of society, like race, gender, and class. They also often navigate barriers in education, economic opportunities, and healthcare, while also fighting to preserve their cultural identities against the backdrop of a society that devalues their traditions. Nevertheless, these challenges aren't unique to Ecuador. As we unpack these issues, we'll explore how similar the situation in the United States and other parts of the world is, touching on education, cultural preservation, and also inequality. Today I am joined by two guests from Kenyon College, Kat and Truly, who will help us develop this discussion and also get a better idea of the challenges faced by Indigenous women in different societies. So, first of all, would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
Yes, I'll start. My name is Truly Martin. I'm a junior at Kenyon College, and I'm a psychology major and English minor.
Hi, my name is Kat, and I'm a sophomore here at Kenyon College, and I am an international studies and Spanish double major.
Okay, great. Thank you. So for the first question, I wanted to talk about a bit about the social structures and intersectionality. So here in Ecuador, Indigenous women face a lot of sociological barriers rooted in their, as I said, in their intersection of race, gender, and also like class. As I said, these structures have been shaped by the colonial history of the country, and now affect areas like education, like the education these women receive, or like in their political participation, because they are really misrepresented in politics here in Ecuador. Also, Indigenous women often experience double marginalization within their communities due to like patriarchal norms and like traditional values, and also in like the broader Ecuadorian society due to racial discrimination. So my question for you is, do you think that similar patterns of intersecting inequalities exist in the United States?
Yeah, I think that similar patterns of intersecting inequalities definitely exist in the United States. Latina women are not societally expected as much to get an education like their male counterparts are. This really speaks to the machismo versus marianismo cultural expectations of gender norms. The indigenous groups in Ecuador are hit much harder than the U.S. groups. We can connect this to the aspect of interactive intersectionality. Interactive intersectionality is based on the fact that one part of your identity can magnify the discrimination that you're going to face with another part of your identity. The marginalization of Indigenous women in Ecuador is really amplified within their own communities on an individual level from patriarchal norms and in society because of racial discrimination.
I also agree that similar patterns of intersecting inequalities exist in the U.S., especially for women of color. And this trend can especially be seen in differences for like medical care for women of color as opposed to men, but especially white men. And these intersecting inequalities are often like especially heightened for Black women and then like Latina women in medical context, and specifically like in the instance of Latina women, we've talked a little bit about how like kind of a language barrier can place a really great strain on like Latina women in specifics, like access to like appropriate medical care. So like it's like obviously hospitals are required to have like translators that like can be accessible for all patients, but sometimes it is hard to actually get like in contact with these translators and like have like easy access to them at the time of their need. And it's generally not the like, even though it aims to be accessible, it's not always as accessible as it should be for like non-English speakers, but especially Latina women in the US, like in medical areas. And then there's also like hierarchies that have been formed like against women of color in the US, both on the basis of them being people of color, but also because they are women. And like especially Latina and Black women are often stereotyped, and like one of the most prevailing stereotypes that you see for these groups is like the stereotype of them like being like sassy or like bossy or something like that.
Overbearing, loud.
Yeah.
Those are common stereotypes as well.
And like you also can like see this like for like Latina and Black women in positions of power who like are kind of often undermined by their like white counterparts, or even not their counterparts, people that may not even have as much like in a workplace setting, like people that may not be as high up in like the ranks of like their workplace setting, but they still are kind of negatively affected by like their peers or like their people that they work with and stuff.
But now, for like the second question I wanted to ask you, I want to talk about educational inequalities and also social mobility. I think that everyone can agree that education is a critical pathway for social mobility. But here, in indigenous women specifically, but also like women in general, in Ecuadorian society, often face systemic barriers that prevent access to this education. Specifically, like in rural schools, because they lack resources, instruction sometimes isn't offered in like the indigenous languages these women speak, so that and also like because traditional gender roles here in Ecuador are really strong, they are still very vital here, and often prioritize boys' education over like girls' education, so because they have to like stay at home and like help their mothers and like the family with the household. Also, I think it's important to say that these barriers reflect broader societal structures that also limit like the upward mobility within society. So how do you think that education functions as a tool for maintaining or challenging social hierarchies in the US? And also, like, do you think that there are any parallels between these barriers and the educational inequalities faced by marginalized groups that you know of?
Yeah, we had a unit in our class called the Miseducation of Latinos, and it was basically just like an overview of how the systemic barriers and discrimination that they've faced throughout history, also including like a lot of problems with immigration, have really put them at a very large disadvantage in school. And I think it's kind of contradictory to what, people, when they think of America, they think of the American dream and like the myth of meritocracy that is basically encompassing the idea that if you go to school, you should have equal opportunity with all of your peers to be successful. But that is not the case. Like, there's a lot of issues with race and, discrimination, sexism that impact like Latina, like women and women of color specifically. In the US, education functions as a tool to maintain social hierarchies for some, and it challenges them for others. With many Latina women not expected to go to school via cultural norms, it really limits their upward mobility to get a higher education and eventually start a career. It's difficult for Latina women to move away from their families because of the cultural expectation that they will stay home to take care of their families. There are many barriers to education for Latine people, including lack of access to childcare, mistrust in educational and mental health resources, and cultural values that women must not gain a higher education in order to take care of their families.
Yeah, and one thing we talked about kind of recently in our class is this phenomenon that's known as the leaky pipeline, which describes how Latinx students' enrollment in school has a really large drop-off rate compared to other ethnic groups. So an example that goes along with this phenomena is the fact that 66% of Latinx children don't go to preschool or seek any kind of early education, and you also see drop-off rates as their schooling goes on. And historically there have also just been a lot of educational barriers just for non-white men in general. So there's a bunch of examples of different court cases and stuff that have happened throughout especially the 20th century that have been related to these barriers. So one example is the 1931 case of Alvarez versus Lemon Grove School District, which is a school district in California where white community members requested a separate school for Mexican students, and they did this by arguing for the fact that the school was being overcrowded and stuff like that. And the principal of the school himself he specifically endorsed the segregation by directing Mexican students to seek their schooling in a separate building nearby that was old and unfit to be a place of learning. And that case was in 1931, but also historically in the US, the government itself sponsored the creation of boarding schools for indigenous people that were known as quote-unquote Indian schools during the 19th and 20th centuries. And these schools attempted to convert indigenous people to Christianity and quote-unquote assimilate them into white American culture. But it was really just a race, an attempt to erase indigenous culture. And this is kind of similar to what we see now, or what we know now as whitewashing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because here in Ecuador we see a lot of change also. I think that for these indigenous people, indigenous women, access to education has improved a lot because in the past centuries, even as not far ago, 50 years or so ago, the indigenous people, everyone from indigenous groups didn't have a lot of education or even any education at all. There were a lot of people that were illiterate, that didn't know how to read, didn't know how to write. So yeah, I think it has improved a bit here in Ecuador, and also I think as you've said in the US, but it is still really there's still a lot of problems that these groups face. So now for our third part, we're gonna talk about a bit of the role of cultural identity in structural inequalities. Here in Ecuador, we see that the preservation of cultural identity is both a source of strength and also a barrier within society, because we have everything within this society in which we live in here in Ecuador is dominated by mestizo norms and norms that were being put in by the colonizers that came, or the people that came in power that were mestizo. And indigenous women often are expected to conform to these societal standards, even though those don't represent their values or traditions. And that also creates additional layers of exclusion in institutions, like in healthcare or in the job market, because they don't feel represented, or they don't feel these norms align with their values. From a sociological standpoint, I would say that I would want to ask you, how does cultural identity intersect with these structural inequalities we see, for example, here in Ecuador with these indigenous women in the US, and like in your own experience? And also, can you think of any examples where this cultural expression has been stigmatized or excluded from public spaces?
Yeah, I think that many cultural expressions from Hispanic people have not just been stigmatized or excluded in public spaces, but changed to match American culture. This is touching on what Kat just brought up as whitewashing. This is known as whitewashing culture. For example, in Midwestern America specifically, like where Kat and I go to school, it's really difficult to find an authentic Mexican restaurant in particular. Most of them have foods that have been changed to be more appealing to white people, completely devaluing the culture and heritage of people from Mexico. Something, I know I've talked about this a lot, but something to touch on is the, kind of going on a separate tangent, is the Marianismo expectation of many Latina women. Marianismo emphasizes the role of the woman as family and home-centered. It is a construction of the expected female gender roles based on the Virgin Mary, which encourages self-sacrifice and sees Latinas as a pillar of the family. Marianismo emphasizes chastity and passivity, self-silencing, and respect for the family and gender hierarchies. So I think that in the US, like the cultural identity of Hispanic people, like no matter where they're from, is compromised and kind of, devalued, and that with structural inequalities for women, it's hard for them.
Yeah. One thing that I also think is important to consider is just the fact that structurally, because the entirety of the United States was built on the exploitation and desecration and appropriation of indigenous land, there's so many structural inequalities that negatively impact indigenous people. Since events like what is known as the Trail of Tears, which was the forced migration of tens of thousands of indigenous people in the US, indigenous people have always been structurally disadvantaged just by the nature of settler colonialism, and definitely the way that race was used as a justifying measure for the unethical methods that were taken in order to colonize the US. And there's also this idea about the quote-unquote vanishing Indian, or el indio desaparecido, that has prevailed especially throughout the literature of the 19th century, the 19th and 20th century, and it attempts to erase the history and current presence of indigenous people everywhere. But this is especially seen in the US and Latin America.
Yeah, so I think that what you've said is really true, because we can also see that there's a lot of alienation to these people, to these groups, because people often see them as sometimes even as myths, or people that aren't real, so that they exclude them from society, and make them aside for government choices, for example, or programs, or social programs, because a lot of the times people don't see them as really part of their society because of all of these cultural and structural inequalities they face because of their identity. And so for our last question, I wanted to talk a bit about environmental inequality, and also social roles regarding this environmental inequality, because here in Ecuador, sometimes indigenous women, most of the time indigenous women are the primary caretakers of their families and their communities. and they rely heavily on natural resources like water, like food from like the forests and like the fertile land where they can like grow their crops. But here in Ecuador, there has been a lot of exploitation and like environmental damage made by big corporations or like even from the government. And for example, by deforestation, by mining. Mining is a really big problem here in Ecuador. And also like oil drilling, especially in the Amazon. These are really big problems for like these indigenous groups and indigenous women. And all of these problems also like exacerbate their economic and social sorry. And all of these problems also exacerbate their economic and social vulnerabilities because like they amplify all of the problems they already face in other aspects of society by making their resources they need to like function properly not as available as before. So in your view, how do the traditions of these women or like indigenous women in the US and their societal roles within their families or like within their communities shape the way this environmental inequality is experienced? And also, can you think of any example in the US specifically where environmental challenges have disproportionately impacted specific groups or roles, like for example Latino groups or like Black groups or like indigenous people?
Yeah, I feel like with the mass exploitation, bless you. I feel like with the mass exploitation of natural resources worldwide, it's really difficult for many indigenous communities to continue their cultural practices and ways of life in the modern age. Indigenous women in the U.S. have roles in society that keep them in control of their families. They're seen as a pillar of their families and are expected to take care of them and not follow their own goals. This is a cultural expectation. I feel like, I'm from the Pacific Northwest region of the U.S. where it's basically, if you've heard of the Oregon Trail, it's basically where it ended. And before, Lewis and Clark got there and before all of the white people got there, there was a very successful Native American population with many tribes. And, growing up, kind of learning, having that be kind of like a really memorable part of my schooling as a child. Like, I went to a reservation and I watched like a Native American ceremony, and it just made me really sad thinking about like, these Native and indigenous populations have so little left of their history because of colonization and kind of like moving those populations out through violence that is really just dwindling. And I think that, with all of, with what America is today, like there are reservations for Native Americans to live in, but those areas are really kind of like unsafe and don't have a lot of like kind of laws, and it's just a really complicated situation. And that, these populations are in these positions now because of like the environmental harm that we've done to their land. Like, they were just there before, doing their, living their lives, having their methods of like how to live off the land and to support themselves for generations. And now that's not the case anymore.
But like going back to like environmental challenges, my understandings are like more largely centered in Latin America and not the US, because I took like an agrarian justice anthropology course that had a large focus on like environmental stuff in Latin America. And one of like the most major examples that I can think of that's also like really often cited is the deforestation of the land in the Brazilian Amazon. That's largely for the purposes of tree farming, but also, as you said, like oil drilling. But it's also been used for like harvestation of like rubber and stuff, as you like can see with like Henry Ford, like the founder of like Ford, like vehicles, and also like he like created like the assembly line and stuff like that. Like he's known for that, but he's not known for the fact that he created like a kind of like quote unquote like town that was based on the rubber extraction industry, where they were like employing the people who originally lived on the land to work like in these plants that he like had kind of developed for like manufacturing of Ford vehicles, specifically through the use of like rubber and like the rubber that he was extracting from the environment. But also like with the deforestation and clear cutting of trees, it has really adverse impacts on the agricultural techniques of local indigenous populations, because some of the most commonly used agricultural practices amongst these indigenous populations is known as swidden agriculture, or you might know it as slash and burn. But this method is it mimics natural forest succession, and it keeps the land fertile, making it one of, if not the most sustainable agricultural practices possible for the area. And like the deforestation that occurs for the purpose of tree farming is not sustainable because it doesn't like effectively mimic the biodiversity of the land that like this like tree farming is occurring on, and it like depletes the nutrients of the land and completely changes like the topography as well, leaving the land essentially infertile and like kind of inhospitable for the indigenous people whose land it like originally was. And also like because indigenous people are like the original inhabitants of the land that the US occupies, they have like a much better understanding of the environments here that has like been formed over time, but their understandings and the indigenous people themselves have been silenced and systematically suppressed, which like means that their understandings of it aren't considered. So like indigenous people lived in the areas where they lived because they knew how to sustainably maintain their land while also supporting their populations. But the ways that their land has been appropriated and like taken over by like through the process of colonization has made it really unsustainable. Like the practices that you would see like indigenous people performing in specific areas were like specific to the like environmental qualities of like the biomes that they were living in. But nowadays you kind of just see like land being used for like kind of what's known as like agricultural appropriation, where you're trying to further the agriculture industry itself without considering the ways that like would be actually most effective for the land, and it's all like for like the furthering of profit, and it's like really tied into like the capitalistic market and stuff that we have in the US. But also like environmental challenges themselves also disproportionately affect like agricultural workers too, and like especially in the American Southwest, like specifically California, you see a lot of like migrant agricultural workers, and a lot of these workers are like Latino, or like they are have immigrated for the purpose of doing this labor. And like not only have they historically had their labor exploited, but also as climate change has progressed, their labor conditions have grown even worse. Like nowadays they're like subjected to like an even like higher risk of like heat stroke, and just like so many other negative factors. Like it's so many layers to the ways that
Okay, thank you very much, Kat. Thank you truly for joining me in this conversation. I think it was really interesting to hear your perspectives in this topic. Today I can say that we explore how indigenous people, not only women but also like indigenous people in general, often face systemic barriers tied to their identities, to their roles within society, and also how these struggles connect to broader sociological patterns of inequality and marginalization worldwide. As we can see, there are a lot of similarities between what these groups face in Ecuador and what these groups face in the US. And yeah, so thank you again for joining me. It was a nice discussion, and yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course.